This edition of Doorstep History features the story of a Ladywood man, Thomas Waldin, who volunteered for the army in 1915. After just 6 months on the Western Front, his luck ran out, and another remarkable chapter to his life was about to unfold. His story is told by Andrew Norman, who knew him as Thomas was his grandfather, and he's told his story in this book, A Brummie Boy Goes to War.
Well, my grandfather, Thomas Waldin, he was born on the 8th of May 1895 at Back 44 Edward Street, Birmingham. His father, John, was a saddletree maker. In other words, he made the wooden frames for the saddles on which the riders rode their horses. And his mother, Helena, was a metal burnisher. Now, this was Helena's second marriage, so she already had 6 children by her first marriage. The first child of John and Helena was May, and Thomas was born 2 years later. Their lives were very, very hard. John was not in good health. Helena found it difficult to make ends meet, and in the end she had to send the children away to school. The girls went to the Bluecoat School in Birmingham, but my mother thought that Thomas had also been to the Bluecoat School. But when I consulted the archivist there, she couldn't find any record of him. And then I suddenly wondered if he'd been to Bernardo's, so I contacted them, and amazingly enough, they sent me a photograph of him and the dates he was there, which was for a period of roughly 6 months. So the fact that the children and he were able to be catered for in a residential accommodation really saved him and the siblings from the workhouse because they were so poor. Well, eventually, Mother Helena got a job as a housekeeper. Up until then, she'd been more or less taking in washing and doing odd jobs. She then had enough money to support Tom, and he came back home to Edward Street, and then they subsequently moved to Icknield Street. At the age of 12, Thomas left school and became an apprentice silversmith to the Birmingham firm of Ades in the Jewellery Quarter. This is where his siblings worked, his half-siblings worked. And then, of course, he was overtaken by events when the First World War broke out. Everyone else was joining up. This wouldn't have been seen as anything unusual. In fact, you'd have been vilified if you hadn't joined up. And he was in one of Kitchener's new armies, volunteers, having responded to Kitchener's posters pointing the finger and saying, "Your country needs you." He did his basic training at Winchester Barracks, which is the headquarters of the Rifle Brigade, and sailed for France on the 20th of May 1915. About 6 months before Tom's arrival at the front, the British had exploded a massive mine, ammonal explosive, under the German fortifications at a place called Hooge, which is a mile or two northeast of Ypres, and this had caused a massive crater. The Germans then started surrounding the outside of this crater and using it as a springboard to attack the Rifle Brigade. And they did this with what the Rifle Brigade diarist calls liquid fire. In other words, a flamethrower attack. And there were 4 companies in the Rifle Brigade, A, B, C and D. The total number of men involved was about 650. Tom was in B company. The other companies were in the front line, or the support trench, but he was more or less in reserve in the wood behind the line, and that's the only reason he survived, basically, because the liquid fire just killed the entire company that was on the left flank. That was about nearly 200 men. And his company then attempted to counterattack, but were beaten back again. And it was a very disastrous day for the Rifle Brigade, and a great shock to be confronted with this liquid fire, which they hadn't experienced before. Well, this was probably the most dramatic event, apart from his final wounding when the Germans swarmed over the edge of this crater, having attacked with flamethrowers, killed all the company in the far trenches, which you can see from the camera, killed a lot of them in the near trench. Thomas Waldin was in Zouave Wood in reserve behind with the 4th Company, so he was fortunate to escape that particular attack. But when they were ordered to counterattack, he was wounded.
So what does it feel like to you to actually be here in that spot?
Well, when you read about horrible things happening in wartime, you know, you see them on the television, you feel a bit detached. When you actually see the place where the flamethrower attack occurred, it brings it home to you. And having just visited the Hooger Cemetery, it certainly brings it home to you with a vengeance. On the 3rd of December 1915, that was a crucial day in Thomas Waldin's life in the front line, because that was his last day in the front line. The weather was terribly bad, it was wet, the trenches were waterlogged.
So Andrew, we're actually at the trench, so this spot here, this is the last thing that Thomas would have seen. It's quite amazing thought, really, isn't it?
Yes, this was where Thomas Waldin and his colleagues were told to get out of the trench, vacate the trench, stand up behind the trench and polish their buttons prior to an officer's inspection. Nobody would have questioned an order in those days, however ridiculous it was. And of course, because this ground is all open, the Germans would have immediately spotted them. And within a few seconds, I imagine, 2 mortar shells exploded, one in front of him and one behind him and his colleagues, leaving him with terrible injuries front and back and blinding him in the process. Well, funnily enough, in the war diary, it mentions that a new officer had just arrived, and that was exactly what my grandfather told my mother. And it was either him who gave the order, or maybe some enthusiastic lower rank in the trenches thinking they were going to be helpful. Inexperience, possibly. Maybe one of them. One can't apportion blame to the exact person. But it was an utterly insane thing to do. We're on a beautiful summer's day here. When he was here, of course, it was December. But we're standing on the exact line of the trench. The Germans would have been probably less than 100 yards distant, and when the 2 shells exploded and he was standing on top of the trench behind it, that would have been the very last thing he ever saw on this earth.
It's amazing to think we're so close to Ypres as well. We can just see it there in the background.
Yes, when he was here, I imagine most of that would have been rubble, apart from just a stump of the cloth hall that was left. Everything else was reduced to rubble, but that's within sight of the city of Ypres. Mm-hmm. That shows how close the Germans got to taking the city. Mm-hmm. And this is all pretty flat ground, so very difficult to defend. This is Mika, with whom we're staying in Ypres, and she's very keen on the history of the war and everything. And this little cross, although Thomas Waldin wasn't killed in the war, I thought I would just leave it at the Track X cemetery opposite this trench, just in his memory. Look, I've been waiting to do this for 50 years, and it's really wonderful. I think if you'd asked him if he'd wanted to survive despite his terrible injuries and blindness, he would have said yes, because I remember him as a basically cheerful person, whistling, playing his mouth organ. He never grumbled, he worked extremely hard, had a lovely family life in a loving family, and was very proud of his children. Thomas was then taken to the field dressing station and then to Balliol Hospital, which is just inside the French border.
And quite fittingly, perhaps, the remains of the church now form part of the war memorial in the town.
and he was more or less left for dead. The sister told the nurse to screen him off in the corner, which where they put the patients who were not expected to survive the night. But when they looked at him the next morning, they found to their astonishment that he was still alive. And so they decided to give him his chance and got the doctor to see him. And there was still at that point some hope that he might have some sight in his left eye, but the right eye was so badly damaged. In fact, it had a foreign body in it like a nail, which they had to remove, so they had to excise the right eye. He had numerous shrapnel wounds in his chest, buttocks, legs, and his fingers, the tips of his fingers were burnt. So he was in a very shocking state. So what they did was they gave him his ticket to Blighty, which is what they said when someone was given their pass to go back home, basically. And so he was taken back to the port, put on a ship, hospital ship, to Dover. As if he hadn't suffered enough, the ship was torpedoed on the way across the channel, but it looks as if most, if not all, of the passengers and crew survived. And he finished up in the second London General Hospital in Chelsea.
So tell me a little bit about what happened with his treatment at the hospital.
Well, at the field dressing station, a nurse, which I discovered from my mother only subsequently, had inadvertently poured some Usol, Edinburgh University solution of lime, which was a disinfectant, and got it into his left eye, and possibly destroyed any chance of him regaining sight. So when he was in the second General Hospital, he was told that they would rest the eye and irrigate it, bandage it up, rest it for a couple of weeks, and then see if there was any sight left in it. And he kept listening to the clock ticking, wondering how long it was going to be, wishing the hours away. And then eventually he said to the sister, "When are you going to take the bandages off?" And she said, "We have already taken them off. I'm sorry, but you won't be able to see again. You'll be blind for the rest of your life." And when he was told that, he turned his face to the wall and he didn't speak for 24 hours. Many years later, to my astonishment, my Uncle David, which was Thomas Waldin's third child, showed me the very piece of shrapnel which they had extracted from his right eye. It was about 3 inches long. It was the shape of a thick nail. It appeared to have beveled edges. It was smooth at one end and rough at the other. And this he kept as a souvenir all those years. My grandfather Waldin was very fortunate because his life and the life of Sir Arthur Pearson coincided. Pearson was a great newspaper magnate and publishing proprietor. The Daily Express was one of his publications. He went blind from childhood onwards, and when he could no longer manage his business empire, he decided to devote himself to the blinded soldiers of the First World War. And he arranged for them all to go to the second London hospital at Chelsea. That's how my grandfather happened to be there, where he would visit them and present them with a braille watch and say to them, "I want to discuss your future." This is the very watch which Pearson presented him with at the Chelsea hospital when they first met. And it's of huge significance. It's only a little tiny watch, but it's called a braille watch. He would have told the time by feeling for the hands and the little bumps on it. It still ticks. And Pearson said to him, as he said to all the blinded soldiers, "This is your first step towards living an independent life." And this was psychologically immensely significant to these men who thought really that their lives had come to an end. And here was Pearson saying, "Look, I've done it, you can do it." Several months previously, Pearson had opened St Dunstan's, which was a mansion house owned by an American gentleman called Otto Kahn, who'd lent Pearson the house to be used for as long as he wished in order to accommodate the blinded servicemen. So when Pearson met Thomas Waldin, grandfather, he invited him to St Dunstan's for training. The expression was so that he could learn to be blind. And St Dunstan's offered many different opportunities, like poultry rearing, boot and shoe repairing, typewriting, telephony, physiotherapy, which they called massage, and so forth. And so my grandfather was admitted to St Dunstan's early in 1916, and from there on, his life changed from one of despair to one of hope. The reason why Pearson was so successful was that he developed a holistic approach to the blinded servicemen. He catered not only for their disabilities, he hated the word handicap, by the way, but he also realised that female company was something which they cherished, having been deprived of it in the trenches. And so when matron said to him, "Wouldn't it be a good idea if we invite some local ladies round to take the men out for walks in Regent's Park on a Sunday?" he said, "Yes, that would be a wonderful idea." Well, the result was that my grandfather Waldin met a young lady called Esther, whose father was a church caretaker just round the corner at Barrow Hill Road. And basically they fell in love, and eventually they were married while he was still at St Dunstan's. He was very gifted in not only in his chosen trade of boot and shoe repairing, but also he could make a string bag in record time, and he won a prize for that. This was another occupation the men were encouraged to do. He also was excellent at typewriting, and he won a typewriter as a prize, but he wasn't very good at Braille. He could never really master it. Pearson said to him, "You must keep trying. Master those tiny dots and a whole new world will be opened up to you." But because his fingertips had been singed in the explosion, he wasn't able to feel the dots as well as a normal person would be able to. And that was why he found that difficult. Esther's parents lived just around the corner at Barrow Hill Road. Her father was caretaker at the local church. At first, Mrs. Benwell was very doubtful about Esther becoming involved with a blind man, because she didn't see how he was possibly going to earn his living and be able to support her, and they weren't a wealthy family. So Pearson had the bright idea of inviting them down to St Dunstan's and giving them a conducted tour of the workshops to show them what these men were capable of. And Mrs. Benwell and her husband George were so amazed that it completely changed their attitude towards Thomas, and from then on he realised he had a real ally and friend. And not only that, she went to the cobbler's workshop and learned how she could assist him in his future work.
And when he left St Dunstan's, he set up his own shop.
Well, St Dunstan's had a wonderful aftercare department run by Sir Ian Fraser, who was another blinded serviceman. And they found Thomas a shop immediately opposite the Barrow Hill Church. And that's where he set up with his first shop, boot and shoe repairing. And I've got the photograph of him. Everyone marvelled at how he knew where everything was in this shop. And could, as long as nobody moved anything, he was all right.
Now what we've got here, look, we've got this fantastic teapot. So tell us a little bit about this.
Well, some weeks before my grandfather left St Dunstan's, he was presented by this teapot, and it's actually inscribed to Rifleman Thomas Waldin from Sir Arthur Pearson. And the people of Regent's Park and St John's Wood were incredibly generous towards the blinded servicemen, and they used to donate money in great quantities, and some of it was used to buy the little gifts for the riflemen or the soldiers before they left St Dunstan's. Mm-hmm. He died in 1950. The doctor said that he'd fought his last battle. He had so many pieces of shrapnel in his body, and they weren't able to take them out because it was too dangerous, and he'd fought against this all his life, and eventually it overcame him. But he had a very fulfilled life and a very happy life, really, with he loved his children and his loving wife, who died young, unfortunately. But I remember him with great affection.